we can make plans all day. We can spend our lives planning something. But at the end of the day, it's Allah's plan that takes over. Entire chapter to the story of, Yusuf alayhi salam, his father, his brothers, and about the story of what Yusuf alayhi salam went through. And I think if we look at his story, we get this lesson really, really illustrated again and again. And that is that something can appear on the externally to be negative. And you may not understand why it's happening. You may think it's a bad thing, but that ultimately in the future, it was part of the greater plan of God. It was part of the greater divine design. And I think when you study the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, you see this beautifully illustrated. I'm just going to give a few examples from his life where you see this unfolding. So as you know, Yusuf alayhi salam, when he was very young, he had a dream. And in his dream, he saw that there were stars bowing to him and the sun and the moon. When he told his father, Yaqub, about this dream, Yaqub realized that this meant that his son was going to be honored with prophethood, but he was really afraid of the jealousy of the brothers. So he told him not to tell his brothers about his dream. Now, as the years went on, the jealousy grew of his brothers anyway. They felt like he was preferred, he was special more than they were. And so they devised a plan. And as you know, they ended up taking Yusuf alayhi salam and leaving him in a well. So now this is kind of the first really what seemed like a very unfortunate thing that happened to Yusuf alayhi salam. And it's interesting because this is, once you fast forward to the entire timeline of his story, which of course Yusuf alayhi salam didn't know, but Allah did, right? But when we stand back and Allah shows us the entire timeline, we understand that there was a wisdom to him being left in the well, and that it was part of the greater plan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had for Yusuf alayhi salam. Now, when he got left in the well, one other thing that I thought was really beautiful is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Yusuf that when he was left in the well, Allah inspired him. So Allah gave him Allah let him know, Allah gave him an inspiration that there will come a day where he will inform his brothers about what's happening right now, and they won't know, and they won't be aware. And so from even the onset of this, these tests that Yusuf alayhi salam is going through, Allah is also at the same time, he's comforting him. He's giving him reassurance. Number one, that he's not alone. And number two, that there is a purpose to this, and this is another lesson which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, where he says, Inna ma'al usri yusra, that indeed with the difficulty is ease. And so you see here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us comfort even at the same time as our trials. That's a very important lesson from here. The second traumatic experience of him being a captive. And what's interesting here is I want to just highlight what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says at this point in the timeline of Yusuf alayhi salam. So in ayah 21 of Surah Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, now realize that this is when he's been taken captive. So the translation is, and the one from Egypt who brought him said to his wife, make his residence comfortable. Perhaps he will benefit us, or we will adopt him as a son. Okay, so this is when he's been taken captive. Look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and thus did we establish Joseph in the land. So that blows my mind, because he's just been taken captive. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that this is how we established Yusuf in the land. And then Allah goes on to say, and we taught him the interpretation of events. So this is something that Allah is saying, even though externally it looked like a very, very negative, traumatic experience, and yet the way Allah, there's the way we see it, right? And that's the relative understanding, right? everything that we're going through right now in our lives collectively, for example. There's a relative understanding of the current events, right? But then there's the true understanding, which only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. So you look here at the contrast between the relative understanding of being found in a well and then taken captive, right? Relative understanding. But then contrast that with the real understanding, the true understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where he says that this is how we established Yusuf and this is how we taught him the interpretation of events. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Wallahu ghalibun ala amrih. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he is predominant over his own affairs, over his plan. In other words, it's Allah who's steering everything. It's not me and it's not you. We are not the ones in control of our own lives and our own outcomes. It is ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.